We are joined again today by Dr. Thomas Ward. He joined us, I don't know, several months back. We had a conversation with Dr. Gavin Kerr, and then before that, we had an amazing discussion about your book on SCOTUS. And you have a new book out now, which I'm really excited about. I didn't even know you were working on this. It just came out of nowhere, and I had to reach out to you. It's called After Stoicism: Last Words of the Last Roman Philosopher. People might be wondering, well, who is that? And I'll give you a hint. It's this guy, or good old friend Boethius. And I have a very well-loved copy of the Consolation here. So that's why I was so excited about this, because people will tell you on this podcast, people always say, give me five things to read. And Consolation is always on there. It was such a profound text for me. And I know, for a while in history, like, this was a really significant text, right? Like, everybody read it, and then something happened. So what happened, Dr. Ward? And are you trying to bring us back to where everybody has to read Boethius again? So yeah, help us understand the situation here before we get into your excellent book.
Yeah, well, thanks, Pat, for having me on. It's good to be back. That historical question, I really don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right that it was wildly popular and influential. I mean, not just on theologians and philosophers, but poets, statesmen. I mean, it just was like a crazy bestseller. Some people think, if you're sort of thinking per capita, it might be like the best-selling book ever that's not the Bible or Harry Potter. Number of people out of the whole population who would have read it, or at least been really familiar with it. Now, why is it less famous than it used to be? I really don't know. I don't know when in history it sort of really fell out of fashion, because you might, like, one hypothesis would be, oh, you got these Renaissance humanists, and they don't like the scholastics, and Boethius was well loved by the scholastics, and so they're going to be disposed not to like Boethius. That doesn't really make a lot of sense for Consolation, because it's so elegantly written. It has all of the virtues that the Renaissance humanists wanted. I don't know where to place that loss of popularity, but
you're here to fix it. That's what matters.
I'm here to fix it, and I think that lots of us are. So people like you, people like me, who were exposed to it in college and had a really profound experience reading it, and then now teaching it or doing podcasts on it or whatever. But if you look on, like, the Amazon bestseller lists for areas like medieval philosophy or medieval thought or ancient thought, the Consolation of Philosophy is, at the tops of those lists in several different translations. By the way, I want to give a shout out to that Goins and Wyman translation, which is my favorite. It's the one that I teach from. So that Ignatius Press edition that you held up, I think that's a top-notch and translation. And then it has this nice collection of essays in the back.
It does. Yeah, those are really good. Yeah. There's so I'll link this as well as your book. So okay, let's back up a little bit, because he's not as popular these days. Who are we even talking about? So give us a little bit of background. So two things I want to hear from you, Dr. Ward. Who is Boethius? And two, how did you get interested in him? It's like to the point of wanting to write and dedicate an entire book to his thoughts. So if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So Severinus Boethius was a Roman statesman. He was a senator, served as consul twice, I think. Toward the end of his life, he was appointed master of offices, which is a sort of, speaker of the House or something like that, an elevated status within the Senate. So seemed to enjoy all the favors of the barbarian Arian Gothic king Theodoric, until Theodoric turned on him. And he was accused of treason, probably on false charges meant to simply bring him down. Theodoric seemed to believe the charges, sentenced Boethius to prison and execution. And then when he was in prison, he was feeling really down and sat down and wrote this Consolation of Philosophy to try to console himself with whatever resources philosophy had to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to his downfall, he was in addition to being a statesman, he was a scholar. He translated or commented on works of Aristotle and Cicero and Porphyry, and had this grand ambition to show the Latin-speaking Romans that the great systems of Plato and Aristotle could be harmonized. And he really thought of that scholarly work as a kind of political act, like
Right.
working for the common good.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, when he was in prison, he couldn't finish that work. He actually didn't get very far. Wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, died a few months later. He was only 42 years old, which is the year that I turned, or the age that I turned, like 3 days ago. So
Yeah, by the way, for people who didn't know,
I'm in my Boethian year.
You're in your Boethian year, and I also have to tell people that my son was born on your birthday.
Hey,
congratulations!
So
October 25th. Awesome day. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But as far as my personal relationship with Boethius, sounds similar to yours. And in college, I just had it was assigned, and the title really interested me, and the cover image had like an image of the Wheel of Fortune and this sort of medieval illuminated manuscript sort of style. And so I was really intrigued by it. So it was one of those texts that I actually read the summer before I knew that it was going to come up, so I read it over the summer slowly and was just absolutely blown away by it. Mm-hmm. So it always stuck with me. And I think it was one of those formative texts that sort of moved me in the direction of becoming a scholar of medieval philosophy.
Yeah.
Because so much of the Middle Ages were brought into being by Boethius and the worldview that he expresses in the Consolation.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of always stuck with me. It's been a great teaching interest of mine. I've never written scholarship on it. Mm-hmm. And until last year, I was talking with a buddy, and we realized that this year, 2024, is the 1500th anniversary of Boethius's execution. Mm. And we were thinking, gosh, it'd be great to do something to mark that in some cool way.
Yeah.
So I kind of conceived the idea of the book from there. And I decided what I wanted to do with it was, instead of make it a really super scholarly book, I wanted to kind of take basically my teaching notes, and then all my experience in the classroom, like the kinds of things that I say, the kinds of things that kind of questions that students tend to ask, and try to get all that worked up into a single manuscript. And shout out to those guys at Word on Fire Academic for being receptive of the idea. David Augustin was my editor, and was really, really happy to move forward with it. So I wrote it super, super fast.
Yeah.
To get it out on time, but it came out of like 20 years.
Years and years and years. Yeah. So it took you 20 years to be able to write this in 5 days or whatever it is, right? Yeah. So I want to show it off again, because as I was saying before we began to record, I am so impressed with the production quality of Word on Fire. I mean, I'm like super jealous, right? This looks so good.
Yeah, they do a great job.
Yeah.
They even included the blue ribbon marker.
Yeah, it's really great. They're crushing it. Yeah. Oh, I didn't even notice that. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, let's dive into his thought. So actually, the first thing isn't really his thought, it's more of his practice. And you have a section in here, I should say. It's really fascinating. Philosophy as therapy. So yeah, should people fire their therapists and call up you, Dr. Ward? This is actually, but in seriousness, this is therapy. Don't leave your therapist. Don't please. I don't want any lawsuits, right? But I don't know if you're having deep existential angst over whether existence is really attributable to concrete particulars. I mean, how much is your therapist really going to be able to help you with that? Right.
That's right. Yeah.
So, one thing that I maybe want to draw your thought out on here is, and what I loved about the Consolation of Philosophy is it showed the practical real world benefit of philosophy, that it really can be a consolation, right? And it can help you get your head on right and deal with, the tragedy of life. I mean, this is a man who's on death row, and he's literally therapying himself with philosophy, right? And so either what he's doing here is really legitimate, really good, really virtuous, where it's I don't know, deep, desperate, wishful thinking, How should we think about it? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All of that is really well said. One of the things that's so remarkable about it is that he, as you know, the main character of the Consolation of Philosophy is Boethius himself. Boethius the prisoner, and then there's Boethius the author. So Boethius the prisoner is met in prison by Lady Philosophy, and they have a long dialogue, and it's dramatic, and there are beautiful poems, and they seem to make progress. And then Boethius has doubts, and so they have to revisit some issues and go off on tangents. So it's dramatic and philosophically rich and all of that. But the therapeutic aspect is, the way that Boethius portrays himself at the start of the Consolation of Philosophy. He is either suicidal or is like indulging in like the almightiest pity party ever.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Where maybe not suicidal, but just woe is me, woe is me, woe is me.
Right. Yeah.
And Lady Philosophy's task is to get him out of that horrible condition.
Yeah.
And so like, why philosophy? It's so interesting. But I think there's an assumption there that so much of what's wrong with us has to do with incorrect beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So one of like the first tasks that Lady Philosophy tries to get Boethius to see is you think that the reason you're miserable is because of your bad fortune, because you're in prison and you've lost your status and your wealth, and that's not the main reason you're miserable. The main reason you're miserable is because you think that true happiness can only be found with those goods of fortune. And so now that you don't have those, you're miserable. What you need to learn is that true happiness does not depend on those goods of fortune. They do some benefits for us, and she talks about that later in the book. But the urgent task is that he disconnect his understanding of what happiness is from possession of and enjoyment of the goods of fortune.
Yeah.
So insofar as you think that like incorrect belief, or like forgetting what you used to know can be tied to your overall affective state, then yeah, there in that sense, there is a place for philosophy in a therapeutic mode.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because philosophy can't directly appeal to your emotions or deal with those, but insofar as how we feel about things are connected to how we believe about things.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can.
Yeah, so that's brilliant, and I think that's absolutely correct. And this might be a good way to maybe contrast some of the thought of Boethius with Stoicism, right? Because it's not just about, yeah, I mean, like kind of owning up to the adversity, and it isn't the things that happen, but how you think about them. Those types of maxims, like that's important. That's acknowledged. Uh, but Boethius he's engaged in a sort of systematic worldview construction too, right? I mean, this is the interesting thing about the Consolation of Philosophy is that it is a book about providence. It is a book about the problem of evil, really, right? And about God and about how everything sort of hangs together. It's not just about how to deal with it psychologically. I think that he really thinks that you deal with it psychologically by having the right sort of world picture, right? To see how everything hangs together, right? Not just like taking 10 deep breaths whenever you're stressed or something like that, which is fine. Again, not discouraging anything like that. Progressive muscle relaxation, all good. But I think the thing I want to draw out here is, well, 2 points actually. One is the other interesting thing about Consolation is, even though it has all that stuff in it, it's not really an explicitly Christian or Catholic text. In fact, that's kind of part of the controversy. Like, there's actually a good essay in here, kind of like arguing for Boethian's Catholicism against some people who are wondering, like, was he really Christian? So it isn't, if you're thinking like this is going to be like a very Christian heavy text, it's not.
Yeah.
It is a philosophical text. But yeah, maybe you could just comment on that briefly if you have any thoughts. And then the other point would be, contrast this with maybe some of the Stoic thought that you had in mind when you came up with this title of After Stoicism.
Yeah, good. The Stoics had a kind of doctrine of providence, but they thought that everything was fated, that
Deterministic, right? Yeah.
deterministic, that we didn't really have any control at all over what happens to us. The only thing we can control, they thought, was our reactions to things. So they try to carve out this like little inner life of freedom when apparently everything else outside is supposed to be totally deterministic.
Yeah, that always was a little hard for me to buy into, right?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental incoherence there.
Mhm.
But but even just conceding that, like, okay, that was their view. Uh, Boethius was very dissatisfied with the thought of a providential world that left no room for freedom.
Yeah.
And so he takes up this challenge of trying to, kind of row with the Stoics on the doctrine of providence, but then depart from them when it comes to freedom. And then you see a similar thing in the more ethical content that takes up the first three books of the Consolation of Philosophy, where, as you say, the Boethius and Lady Philosophy are happy um, to repeat certain kinds of Stoic maxims. There's nothing, uh, uh, nothing can make you miserable. Only your reactions determine how how you feel about things or whatever. Sort of butchering that one, but
Mhm.
uh, so he likes that stuff, but he doesn't seem to like the Stoics' kind of low view of the importance of personal relationships with other
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
and we could maybe come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
And then two, um, they for the Stoic mindset is that true happiness is not actually possible because of how many things are outside of our control. So the closest approximation to happiness that we can get to is a state of like serenity.
Mhm.
So we detach from things, we cultivate a kind of
Tranquility of mind.
apathy. We get our apatheia, and then when we're suitably detached or apathetic, we can achieve this ataraxia, this
Mm.
tranquility or serenity. And Boethius seems to think that that's much too low a bar for human desiring to aim at.
Mhm.
He agrees with Aristotle and Plato that human human action is always oriented toward true happiness, beatitudo. And so that's another serious departure from Stoicism. So he wants to craft a worldview in which true happiness is possible and true freedom is possible, and in which there is a good God who is our happiness and who providentially governs and orders things toward the good that is
Mm.
himself.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so there's a lot of actually complex and creative thought in the consolation. It seems to be one of the um, sort of original texts so far that I'm aware of. I might be wrong on this. That begins to present a general eternity solution to a number of issues, including human freedom.
Mhm.
And every time I return to the console, I'm always like really impressed. Like obviously the conversation has developed since, Boethius, but like it seems like he really kind of just like got the rudiments right on a lot of things, and in, like a lot of hard issues. Like how do you understand the relation of not just God's providence, but universal causality and
Yeah.
human freedom and
Mm.
all these. And so like he's wrestling with really hard questions, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And he doesn't give lightweight answers, does
mhm.
he? Like
No.
yeah, so I don't know, maybe give us a few examples of some of the deeper metaphysical issues he wrestles with, and ones that kind of struck you as maybe if he didn't work out every last little detail, like this isn't the general right direction. Like this guy was really on to something.
Yeah, good. So we mentioned the providence thing. One of the issues that the sort of context in which providence comes up in the consolation is uh, Lady Philosophy has um, reinforced Boethius's belief in God through arguments, and then Boethius doesn't reject any of that, but he comes to this sort of crisis moment where he thinks, wait, if there is, if God is really like that, perfectly good, uh, why is it that the wicked seem to prosper and the good often suffer? and sometimes even at the hands of the wicked. Like everything just seems screwy. It's not how you'd predict the world to be if all you knew about it is that it had its origin and sustaining cause from a perfectly good
Right.
being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then she has to do some work. Now she says, ultimately the wicked do not prosper because insofar as they are wicked, they will not be able to gain true happiness. And since what we want is happiness, if being wicked they can't get happiness, then in that fundamental sense they are weak.
Mm-hmm.
A way to achieve happiness is in part by becoming good. And so those who are good both have the desire for happiness, because everyone does, and they have the power to achieve happiness because they're good. And so they are actually stronger. That works kind of well for Boethius. He sort of buys it, but he presses deeper and deeper, and we get this image in book 4, this beautiful image of God as a mind who sort of thinks up a plan for the universe. And this plan includes lots of creatures of different natures, some natural, like think organisms, animals,
Mm-hmm.
some rational, and so acting freely, human beings paradigmatically, maybe also angels. So God thinks up this big plan with all these kinds of natures, all doing their thing, acting in accordance with their natures, all harmonized, and all ultimately for the good. And then, not in a temporal sense, but in some sort of logical ordering, then there's the act of creation. And all of that plan just starts playing out. But the key thing for that account of providence, Lady Philosophy reminds us, is that in order for that playing out of the divine plan really to be a playing out of the divine plan, things have to act in accordance with their natures.
Mm-hmm.
They can't just be directly caused by God, or determined by God to do what they do. They have to do it themselves, because that's how God conceived of the world operating in the beginning. So then he calls this plan in the divine mind providence, and then the working out of that plan in history, as he calls it, fate.
Mm-hmm.
Not fate understood in a classical sense as totally deterministic. Instead, just fate in the sense that there is a plan that is working out, and uh, a lot of it we can't control, but then insofar as we're a part of that plan, we are genuine agents and can use our freedom to do good things or bad things.
Yeah.
And
No
there's
question.
more to it than that, as you know, but I feel like that distinction between providence and fate, and that kind of like divine ideas-y thing,
Right.
often gets overlooked by commentators. A lot of us, like philosophy of religion types, they just want to jump straight to book 5, which I know we'll eventually get to.
We'll get there. Yeah.
I think there's that really important moment of the divine plan, including things of different natures acting in accordance with their natures.
Yeah, and that just strikes me as so right. And I think once you appreciate that and meditate on that, it begins to, if not directly resolve a host of difficult issues, it gives you space to see where they can be resolved, right? So if you have this idea of like this sort of radical transcendence of God, that he's a deep metaphysical cause, he's not a cause within the universe like we are, right? It's not like God causes Socrates to raise his hand, right? I guess if we were trying to like make it logically neat, we'd use like external causal operators, right? Like God makes it the case that Socrates raises his hand, right? So God supplies all the being to all that, but there's really a Socrates, and it is Socrates who is really raising his hand, right? And it's all sort of sourced by God. And so, God makes it a case that Socrates freely chooses to eat an apple or something like that, right? And I think when you think about it this way, of different sort of layers of reality and this sort of this transcendent God, right? He seems to really appreciate that, and I don't know. I think he at least help to set the conversation in the right direction, where that would be further developed by, later scholastics and stuff like that. I do find that particularly helpful. And I remember it being especially striking when I first read this. And like you, I had never heard of this, but like this was just assigned to me in college. And
Yeah.
I was just like so amazed by it. So yeah, okay, great. So he's got this really kind of robust idea. I mean, there's so much in his thought. Like I love he kind of develops a Platonic understanding of justice, and his stuff on eternity is really good. But I want to ask you, what's another aspect of his thought that really just kind of struck you and that you get excited to share with people?
Yeah, going through it all for the last year, the sort of deep dive I've done, I've been really geeking out on this claim that God not only is the source of our happiness, but that God is happiness.
Mm.
Is happiness.
Yeah, yeah. You have what's your chapter called? Happy God, I think is.
Yeah, the happy
Yeah.
God. Yeah. And happiness, not again, not in a happy mood, but in this, true beatitude, which it's a kind of self-sufficient state, in which, anything that you need, and in one sense, anything that you truly want, you possess simultaneously and securely and perpetually. So
Yeah.
God is the only thing in the universe that, like, in the absolutely ideal state, could ever satisfy the criteria of what happiness is.
Hmm.
So then it becomes uh, a matter of becoming more like God. That is the route to becoming happier. Not in this like rules-based sense, like, oh, if we behave, then God will grant us the happiness that we seek. But that really and truly becoming, insofar as we become godlike, we take on more and more of the divine nature, which
Yeah.
is fundamentally happiness. Now, what the reason why I've been really focused on this is because thinking of God not as the source of our happiness, but just as happiness, has me thinking thoughts about like the way in which uh, human desiring, although we really do desire happiness, that desiring takes us in some sense outside of ourselves, and it's not fundamentally about achieving some sort of subjective state.
Hmm.
Uh, like a sense of satisfaction, or like firing on all cylinders, or making sure every aspect of my personal reality is like, good or good for me. But it's this sort of reaching out to something else, and
Mm.
fundamentally God, but also I think in some sense other people too, because in order to be in like a truly charitable relationship with other people, you have to will their good, for their own sakes, and not for your own sake. And so there's a kind of, demand of friendship or family commitments that draw us outside of ourselves as well. So I think there's probably something deep there about the object of happiness being something that's always going to be outside of ourselves, and
Hmm.
then as we move closer to it, whether that's in prayer or in um, uh, morally upright behavior, or in loving acts towards other people, whatever it is, whatever that mechanism is by which we become more united with God, that is what makes us happy. And so I've been thinking that there's probably something really deep there in Boethius that kind of transcends the maybe it's like a moment, I think, where there's a kind of mystical or ecstatic kind of insight that
Mm.
in some ways outstrips a little bit the tight syllogizing, and not
Yes.
doesn't go against it, but it's just like, I think Boethius maybe experienced something, where he realized that his happiness was outside of himself. And I've been thinking more generally about that in the, when we think about what a human person is,
Hmm.
we think, well, it's something that is, a social creature, okay, among
Yeah.
other things, but a
Hmm.
social creature. But yeah, okay. But what if there's something like, that human subjectivity is, like, by design meant to be more dialogical,
Mm.
like, with God,
Hmm.
and monological with oneself. And so like, becoming more human is a matter of realizing that, you're not only is your whole psychology naked to the divine eye, but that
Yeah.
but that you're supposed to lean into that as, like,
Mm.
part of what it is to be a you. So yeah, I really like that. That's
Yeah.
yeah,
So I love that for several reasons. I'll try and draw a few of them out. One is that you always hesitate to like bring the Trinity in to do philosophical work because you're like, oh boy, now I'm gonna have to deal with that, right? But at the end of the day, like I think the Trinity is like it's a really befitting thing philosophically because like, hey, if the foundation of reality is just this self-donating infinite font of goodness and love, right? That kind of matches a lot of the things that you're saying when we talk about participating
yeah,
in that, right? God is subsisting relations. Yeah, some philosophical puzzles to work out there, but like, fundamental reality just is love in infinite, yeah, relation between three persons. It's crazy. But I think it shines a light, right? Like if you can get the Trinity online, even if it's just through revelation, it shines a light, right? That you just don't have through other means. And sort of makes the things that you're talking about make a lot more sense, right? To me, anyways. Again, I don't have like a metaphysical demonstration for any of that, but there's a befittingness there that I think should be taken seriously. The other thing to it is, yeah, well, Stump's done work on this. And I think she's done some scholarship on Boethius too, right? And
yeah.
she emphasizes, hey, when it comes to love, yeah, will the good of the other, that's love. But people forget about the other aspect of love, which is union.
Mhm.
Union, right? To will the good of the other, but also to have union with your beloved. You need both of those,
Yeah,
right? And I think that's kind of what you're hinting at, right? There's something about us and our happiness, our flourishing, um, that it wouldn't be possible without that sort of deep interpersonal union with each other and with God as well. So yeah, you'll get nothing but agreement from me on all that. It'd be good to see that explored. I think like I
yeah,
think I think
yeah,
like Stump, Stump's like Atonement and Wandering Darkness, some
mhm,
works that come to mind that really emphasizes the that union and alignment and how you have to have the right sort of will and character for that
yeah,
to be facilitated. And she
yeah.
was obviously inspired a lot by Boethius. So yeah, any other further thoughts you have on it? It'd be cool to hear.
I like the Trinity analogy. I think it's really fitting, as you say. If I could like highlight this other thing too about it's a little bit on the theme of union. So do you remember this image in also in book 4 of the divine mind thought of as like like a simple point with concentric spheres radiating out of it, and the point is called the mind or the divine mind, and then these spheres are something like, probably the order of fate, like the playing
Mhm.
out of that divine plan. And so the spheres are all in motion and things are turning. So the suggestion in this image, it's quite difficult. Maybe I should have read it or something, but
So
the suggestion seems to be like, if you are if you imagine yourself on the outer spheres, distant, very distant from the center, and then like there's all this motion going on, but it's hard to recognize all of that motion as activated ultimately by that divine source in the very center. So things sort of feel chaotic and maybe even random on the outside. But if you really knew what was going on, you would see how even those things are linked up just as well as the circles, most immediate to the center. So if you sort of got that image in mind, then Lady Philosophy says to Boethius that things that are rational, like people like us, we have the ability through our thinking to move closer toward the center. So we can't take that literally. If we're on the outside, like here on planet Earth, we're on the outside of spheres. We stay on planet Earth, but there's a way that in our thinking we can move toward the center. What happens there is that we have a deeper sense of the way in which everything ultimately really is connected up to that benevolent, willing, and causing of the world. Has its ultimate source in God. All right. So then she says, if you achieve that closeness to the center, or to the degree that you do so, you become more free. So there's an increase of freedom as you move toward the center. So what's that connection? And it's a really puzzling part of the consolation. And I think what's going on there is this notion of freedom that's something like this. Well, insofar as your willing is aligned with God's willing, as much as you are privy to what his willing is, then you don't experience anything that happens to you as like finally contrary to your good. And so if you like have some bad fortune, something bad happens to you, and like it hurts, or you're sad or whatever, but you're also connected to the divine center, then you can receive it as something that, even if you don't know exactly how, really is good for you, is finally good for you, even if immediately it seems bad. And so that thing, that bad fortune, is not experienced as a fundamental block to your flourishing. And so in that case, whether the fortune is good or bad, in sickness and in health and so on and so forth, you are doing and experiencing just what you want to be doing. And so you're more free than someone who is, confused and frustrated and wants the world to be a certain way, and it's not. And so, is always experiencing fortune, as at least bad fortune, as as a hindrance to their aims. And I just think, I hadn't really thought about freedom in that way before, and I think that's just so helpful, and even pretty deep. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I remember being, profoundly struck by that as well. And it's right. And I think it's balanced too, in the sense that, you're not just kind of resigning yourself to just, let the world just hit you in any which way. It's
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
that, you still have the obligations that come with having the human nature, right? So like you still have all these more, so you still have or are not obligated to act a certain way, but you're not obligated to control all the outcomes, right?
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that's like the nice, I think that's like a good reminder for all Christians too, right? Is like we have obligations to, to just certain moral obligations, but that doesn't mean that we have to guarantee outcomes.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that's what really gets people across the board, right? Is it's this sort of it's a need of control, right? To
Mhm,
control or guarantee outcomes. And I think what Boethius provides here is a world picture, worldview, where you realize that no matter what the sort of immediate outcomes are, right? As long as your alignment is right, even if you don't see,
mhm,
how those all connect to your good, you have the higher perspective, which allows you to infer with great confidence that they do somehow
mhm,
connect to your
mm.
good.
Yeah.
And so you can receive it in a way that doesn't have to be extremely distressing, depressing, or all those sorts of things. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, well
Mhm.
said. And another thing you mentioned, it's good for Christians, and I think that's exactly right. But you mentioned also at the beginning that the consolation of philosophy doesn't feel very Christian, or it's not explicitly Christian
Yeah.
as you go along. And this is one of those points where I think that, there's clearly a lot of harmony between the philosophical conclusions about providence and freedom and so on
Mhm.
that Lady Philosophy is drawing, and Christianity. A lot of harmony there, but there's something that is like, underdetermined about what Lady Philosophy does. So if you just know, kind of in this very abstract way, where God is good and he's going to make sure all things are finally good, including for me. And so that can sort of put me at ease as I act in the world and make me feel like I'm freer. There's that. But you can't, that doesn't license a very um, fine grained evaluation of what's going on in any particular circumstance. It's all pretty abstract. I think that what the Christian story does is it allows maybe a little bit more license for interpreting your experiences, for maybe understanding your experiences as a bit more connected up to God. And I'm thinking in particular here of suffering. So the way in which we can identify our own suffering with the sufferings of Christ and see that in the eucatastrophe of the crucifixion and resurrection, there's this incredible testimony to hope and the joy that awaits us. And so insofar as we can experience our own suffering as cruciform in that way, then we can experience it like even in the midst of it. It takes a lot of work and training. It's not like you could just say it and you start living that way, but you can get to a stage where your suffering is experienced as a participation in the sufferings of Christ, and so ultimately ordered toward joy. And so anyway, so like there's a kind of generic that's in the consolation, but then insofar as we're Christians, we get this greater specificity of how things really are connected up to the divine goodness.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really well said, Dr. Ward. Okay, I want to touch on just a few more things in our remaining time together. Man, there's so much good stuff here, and I geek out over Boethius. So I'm just grateful to be able to have this conversation. It's so funny. There's the what is it, the Lieber box recordings where you can hear this online, and I'll often just put those on. I like the sound of the dude's voice who reads it because it's like this is really good just to listen to. The consolation.
I should check that out. I'm into audiobooks, but I've never done consolation.
You can find it right on YouTube. Pull it up. So sometimes I'll like literally be playing like Mario Kart with my kids and have just like, consolation just going in the background. Can't help to stew them in that stuff, right? All right, man, goodness. Why don't we talk about goodness? Hard thing to think about, right? It seems so intuitive, common sense, but yeah, what is goodness? You have a section on evil as privation in here. You have a chapter a couple before that on the good. So how does Boethius think about the good? What is goodness? As you said, he seems to in various ways combine Platonic and Aristotelian lines of thought. But whenever I've sort of looked at Boethius, it does strike me as heavily Platonic. And there's a lot that's attractive to me, right? I mean, somebody asked me on social media the other day, I get asked this like every other day on Instagram, Plato or Aristotle. I'm like, these guys were a lot closer than like Plato and Alex Rosenberg, right? They're kind of all in the big tent, right? But I don't know. I've always been attracted to a Platonic way of thinking about goodness, a Neoplatonic way of thinking about goodness. I've been reading a lot of Lloyd Gerson these past couple of years, who's got a lot of really interesting work on that. So help us think with Boethius on what the good is, and we'll start to wade down those channels, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we could go really, really deep here, and I don't think we're gonna quite be able to plumb the depths. But let me say first, so there's the book, what goes on in book 3 about the nature of goodness, 3 and 4 about nature of goodness and evil as parasitic on goodness or the mere privation of goodness. And that's a really important place to go for Boethius on goodness. But then another important place is a separate work that he wrote called De Hebdomadibus, on the hebdomads. And no one knows what hebdomads are, by the way. It's a total mystery why he called it that. But the treatise is called On the Hebdomads. And there he talks about the metaphysics of goodness, and in particular the relationship between divine goodness and creaturely goodness. But here, let me give you what I think of as the sort of fundamental kind of insight about goodness that sort of drives everything else that he says. It is, I think, fundamentally Platonic, but Platonic in a way that's meant to play nice with Aristotle. And so here's what I mean. I think that the fundamental notion of goodness for Boethius is perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you have absolute perfection, and that's God, the good.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have perfection relative to a nature.
Right.
So there's human nature, elephant nature, giraffe nature, and so on and so forth. And each nature sort of has built into it certain kinds of norms or conditions for flourishing. You know, we can tell when a human isn't doing well, whether it's physiologically or mentally or spiritually. And what we mean is that there's something lacking, you know, some kind of uh, potentiality of a human being that isn't being fully actualized. So if you think about natures as having these inbuilt standards, then you can think of goodness in a nature as like maximizing what it is to have that nature. And then you can talk about degrees of goodness as approximation to that ideal. And then you can have there's a bit of a vagueness problem, but then you could have something like a low degrees of goodness below which we start calling the thing bad, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but then you get that if that's the sort of notion, then we get to say that, well, anything that exists um, belongs to a nature, and so as long as it is existing as a member of that nature, then it has some goodness,
Some minimal level of goodness, right?
some
The
minimal level of
first
goodness.
first actuality for Aquinas, right?
First
Yeah.
actuality. So
Mm-hmm.
everything is good,
Mm-hmm.
and then we call bad what isn't up to snuff.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have as high degree of goodness as it ought to have given its nature. All
Yeah.
right. So then we get perfection in a nature and absolute perfection as uh, these two like fundamental notions of goodness
Mm-hmm.
that are unified in this just in the idea of perfection as such. Okay. Um, so then, yeah. So anyway, so I think that's quite nice, and he does a little bit more in De Hebdomadibus to show that connection between absolute perfection and divine perfection. But instead of that, let me say something very quickly about how Aquinas takes this up. You know, you remember in the discussion of goodness, there's uh, blanking on which article, but there's this nice line about how there is one goodness and many goodnesses. And the one goodness, of course, is God, and the many goodnesses are all of these different types of creaturely goodness that are relativized to a nature. And each nature has its own standards of goodness. And so it's to be good, a good giraffe is somewhat different than to be a good human being. And so you get like an Aristotelian account of goodness. Aquinas makes the link between them, um, the divine ideas. So God has all of these ways of thinking about himself as imitable, and his creature concepts are
Mm-hmm.
his concepts of himself as imitable.
Yeah, and you can think of like creative ways that like a cat's tail. How is that good? Well, stability is a wider good that
Yeah,
maybe it
yeah,
participates in stability, stuff like that, right? Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
really really quite neat. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So you get that's the resolution. Boethius
Mm-hmm.
reaches in that direction, and I think Aquinas achieves it. The absolute compatibility of the Aristotelian and Platonic conception of goodness in the divine ideas. Insofar as the divine ideas are thought of as representing or expressing divinity in some way.
Right, and
Isn't
the
that
ways,
cool?
dude. It's yeah, dude. It's so cool. Yeah, no, it's mind blowing. It's awesome because you're like you want that link, right? Like, what is the link between like the goodness of a cat and the goodness that is only all purely positive perfections, right? Which
Yeah,
is God,
yeah.
that are somehow identical to each other in the Godhead, right? Because I'm one of those crazy simplicity people, right? And I think that's right, right? Is that I also like the idea of like a limit case, thinking along like limit cases for that. But that's right, like when you can think of like God has these divine ideas, um, or idea, I guess, right? And you can think of all the ways that things could participate in some limited way, right? in whatever this perfection is, then you can have all these creative ways of analyzing how this thing is participating in the God in this, small way, but it's there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's so cool. It's really cool. So that's awesome. That's exactly what I was hoping to draw out from you. And then, okay, yeah, real quick, because this is obviously a huge conversation on its own, but it's I've been having some discussions with people and been doing a bit of thinking on this as well recently. Is evil is privation, the privation theory. I remember reading something from a colleague of yours, I think at Baylor, Dr. Alexander Prus, and might have just been on his blog or something like that. And he's like, yeah, privation theory. Like if you're a theist, like something like that better be true, right? Right. But there's some philosophical puzzles with it, which he admitted. But he's like, and I think like his intuition's right. Like if you are a theist, you better have something like the privation theory. Why? Because if you don't, you have what's called the metaphysical problem of evil. How does something that's perfectly good produce something that is actually evil? Like that's crazy, right? And I don't think you want to be like a hardcore like consequentialist as a theist, or it's just like there's a deep metaphysical issue there. But if you take a privation theory, whatever other issues aside, you at least don't have to say that, right? Because under this theory, evil doesn't have any positive ontological set. It's not a thing, right? It's something missing. I'm just curious, like, is there a particular account of this that you like? There's kind of standards. Like I'm a Oderberg's book Metaphysics of Good and Evil, I think, is a wonderful defense of privation theory. But then Proust, I think last year or something like that, he had an article saying like, well, we should actually think of maybe along the ideas of evil as just a misarrangement of certain things, right? So it's interesting to see that there's some kind of cool recent work being done on this. I'd just be curious if you want to give a general sketch of anything I've missed so far on privation theory, why you're attracted to it, and then any thoughts on just how you're thinking about it these days. It'd be cool to hear.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Oderberg account or the Proust. I remember Proust saying once in conversation that he had this issue trying to work through the privation theory, but I just don't know. So I can't.
It's things like too many noses. How do you make, like, if somebody has too many noses, and he thinks that if you have a misarrangement thing. But I would say, I mean, those are things that traditional privation theory people have talked about before. I think of Father Brian Davis, right? It's like if a washer machine has too much junk in it, right? There's still something missing there, right? The proper order, right? The proper order, or something like that, right? Right. They're, like at the end of the day, it's a little puzzling, but you can find the privation somewhere in that account, right?
No, that's good. So you don't have to identify every instance of evil as a privation of something or some property. It could simply be a privation of due order. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of my puzzles about the privation theory, and maybe you have a good answer to this.
Not my specialty, so
yeah, sure. But I mean, this is not really a historical puzzle that I'm about to present to you, but just this. So this bothers me. So you have, so let's say you have a bad human action. Like, so what's the privation there? Is okay. So that's privation of the correct intention or the correct action type.
Yeah, Maritain would say
bring about that intention, or
it's the failure to consider what you ought to have considered at the time. What's lacking is the moral rule in a judgment. So that's the thing that's missing, right?
Yeah. So you can give a kind of story there. What about in the case of vicious people? What I worry about is the ontology of vices. So a vice, as you know, it's thought of as a habit, a disposition. And so it's something other than the power or faculty that it so disposes.
Right.
So then if we have, take a vice like greed. If we say, instead of just like, this person sometimes acts greedily, but like this is a vicious person insofar as she's like really greedy. What is that greed? And you can't, it doesn't seem like, if you're going to have to say that it is a thing, I don't think there's any way of saying, well, it's like a bad arrangement of things, or that
Yep.
it's that greed is good in itself, but
Yeah. So I have a pseudo solution here, and
good.
it's a punting solution because I don't have it fresh on my mind, so I don't want to butcher it. But in Oderberg's book, he looks at hatefulness and malice
Great. I
and
should check that out.
these.
I should check it
And
out.
yeah,
Yeah,
so I was just gonna say, if people are interested in that, I know for a fact that that is covered in Oderberg's book, and he obviously thinks that it can be handled. But I won't do him the disservice of leaving out the details that escape my memory at this point. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no, fair enough. But thanks for that. Yeah, I really should read it, because this has been bugging me for a while.
Yeah, I mean, there's tricky things, right? And how do I think about it, right? I think about the privation theory like this. I defend it in my book like this. Is like, it seems like once you follow Geach with, predicative versus attributive adjectives, like you're into privation theory, right? Like
Yeah,
it just comes from philosophy of language. It solves a host of issues. I think it is actually quite darn intuitive at the end of the day, right? For a theist, it seems like the only real game in town, unless you want to have a lot more issues than some tricky puzzles, right? But
yeah,
there's tricky puzzles in everything. So like my thing is, okay, these are tricky puzzles, but I don't see that these puzzles don't have a resolution. At worst, I
yeah,
just haven't seen what it is yet. I think that's kind of like a good mindset to have in general for a lot of things, especially when you have a theory that seems to do it's a real powerhouse, right? Like you don't
yes.
throw the whole thing out because you got like a few tricky puzzles, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and I like that you've uh, made explicit that while this is a really good theory to adopt given theism, there are a whole bunch of other reasons, or at least several very powerful reasons to adopt it independent of theism. So it's just, if you think, I mean, basically, I think if you think that there are natures, and if you think that everything that exists has a nature,
Mm-hmm.
and belongs to its nature essentially, that's all you need. Yeah,
Right.
like, then at least you might have something else, but then you're going to have some account of goodness as relative to a nature, and as living up to or failing to live up to the norms that are built into the nature that you have. Um, and then you're off and running. And I think I mean, that's a basic Aristotelian sort of insight. You don't have to be like a full-on Platonist to
Right.
buy the privation theory of evil. And that sort of account, you could run that almost totally naturalistically, or and go a long way without running into big problems. I think theism, obviously, is the better view, and ultimately makes better sense of why there are natures, why there are the natures there are, and so on. But yeah, you don't have to
Yeah.
adopt privation theory of evil simply because it plays so nicely with theism.
Yeah, thank you for emphasizing that. That's right. I don't think that you should adopt it just because of theism. I think if you're a theist, you better adopt it.
Yeah,
Right? But no, certainly you can be open to it. I think you probably should be persuaded by it for independent reasons.
yeah, right,
Like I
right.
said, Geach has some great stuff on this. David Alexander has a good book. I think it's like God, Goodness, and Evil or something like that. It's another good one too. So it's cool to see the literature popping up on that sort of stuff. Dr. Ward, this has been great. Let's talk again, finally, about where people can get a copy of this truly excellent, really beautifully produced book. It's called After Stoicism, Last Words of the Last Roman Philosopher, published by Word on Fire. Well, yeah, where's the best place to grab a copy?
Yeah, what the Word on Fire people tell me is that it's better to go straight to the publisher. The Word on Fire Academic is the imprint. So if you just Google that with the title, you'll find it. And you'll also be able to see all the other awesome stuff that Word on Fire Academic is up to. I mean, it's a sort of newer imprint, but they've published, their catalog is growing. They publish things that you've probably heard of, like Michael Ward's After Humanity, his commentary on C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. Some of Holly Ordway's books on J.R.R. Tolkien have been published by them. So maybe just go to the website and see that. But if you're opposed to that for whatever reason, if you're just addicted to Amazon, it's there too.
Yeah, guilty.
It costs quite a bit more on Amazon. So
yeah. Good. Well, I will link to the Word on Fire one in the show notes. And then for you, what are you working on next? What should people keep an eye out for?
Yeah, well, I'm doing. It's kind of.
Oh, you have I'm sorry to interrupt. You have the new scope. We got to have you back on to talk about mention that real quick, please, and then talk about your future projects.
Yeah. Okay. So this other guy that I really admire, John Duns Scotus, someone I know, died in 1308. He wrote this amazing masterpiece of natural theology called De Primo Principio, the treatise on the first principle. It's extraordinarily creative and rigorous. It's also very difficult. I just came out with a new translation of it, with a long commentary. The commentary is actually longer than the text itself, just trying to help people understand it. I don't even think that I can't like keep all the details in my own mind. I have to like go back and see what I thought about it a year ago. But that just came out with Hackett. So it costs like $15, maybe less. Brand new translation, long commentary. It's good. I can't wait for philosophers to get their hands on it and see what they make of the argument.
Yeah, I have it. So I will be bugging you to come back on to discuss it. Okay. Then finally, what's in the pipeline? What are you working on next?
I wrote this thing on divine ideas a few years ago, and I had always intended to do like a big book, like a big important book on that stuff, and go much deeper both in the history and the systematicity than I did in the little book. And so that was just a kind of prolegomenon. So now that I'm just about to clear my plate of a couple random articles and stuff. But yeah, that's kind of going to be my next big thing, probably like a 5-year project. And then I really want to write this book on the good, the true, and the beautiful. I really want to figure out why those three go together in the sort of contemporary classical Christian education networks. Because as you know, beauty was not one of the like traditional transcendentals. So I'd like both to understand the kind of social history of how that development happened, and then try to give like an accessible, systematic metaphysics of the GTB, as it's sometimes called. So that'll be more of like a general audience level book, and the divine ideas will be more of just like hard hitting academic stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Excited about all of that, Dr. Ward. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Pat. I really enjoyed talking with you.